There's a version of Al Capone that history remembers clearly. The silk suits, the scar, the Tommy guns and the speakeasies and the blood on the floor of a Chicago garage. The man who made presidents uncomfortable and rivals disappear. The man who ran a criminal empire worth $100 million a year, who corrupted an entire city, who became the face of American organized crime for generations. That version is real. It happened. The violence was real, the power was real, the fear he inspired was real. But there was another version that history has mostly forgotten. A version that existed in a small apartment in Brooklyn, at a kitchen table set for Sunday dinner, where a heavy-set Neapolitan woman named Teresa Capone would look at her son with eyes that had seen through every version of him since the day he was born, and where that son, public. Enemy number one would sit quietly and eat his soup and not say a word out of turn. Teresa Capone was the one person on earth who could make Al Capone behave, and she was the one person on earth whose love he never once questioned. Teresa was born in Angri, in the Campania region of southern Italy, in 1867. She married Gabriel Capone, a barber, and in 1894 they joined the millions of southern Italians making the crossing to America, not for adventure or ambition, but simply because staying meant hunger and going meant possibility. They settled in Brooklyn, in the dense Italian immigrant neighborhoods where everyone knew everyone and poverty was so universal it barely registered as deprivation. Gabriel opened a barber shop. Teresa raised children. They had 9 of them in all, and Alphonse, Al, the 4th child, was born on January 17, 1899. Teresa was not a gentle woman in the sentimental sense. She was strong and practical and unsentimental in the way that immigrant women often were, shaped by hard crossing and harder circumstances. She didn't indulge her children. She expected obedience, respect, hard work. She was the center of gravity around which the entire family orbited, and everyone, her husband, her children, eventually her grandchildren, knew it. But with Al, there was something particular. Something between them that existed apart from her relationship with the other children, an intensity of connection that both of them felt and neither could have easily articulated. He was her most difficult child, the most volatile, the most stubborn, the most prone to trouble. And perhaps because of that, the one who needed her most. She didn't approve of his choices, that was clear. From early on, when Al began running with street gangs as a teenager, when he dropped out of school at 14 after striking a teacher, when he started coming home with bruised knuckles and stories that didn't quite add up, Teresa would look at him across the kitchen table with an expression that contained more judgment than any lecture ever could. "You're wasting yourself," she would say in Italian, because English never fully felt like a language for important things. "You're better than this." Al would look at the table, not at her. He couldn't hold her gaze when she looked at him that way. "I'm fine, Mama. You're lying to me, and you know I know." He did know. That was the thing about Teresa. She always knew. When Capone moved to Chicago in 1920 and the empire began to grow, he maintained the connection to his mother with it. Consistency that surprised people who knew him. Letters when he was busy, phone calls when letters felt insufficient, and whenever he could arrange it, which was more often than his enemies would have expected, visits to Brooklyn, to the apartment where Teresa still lived, to the kitchen table where everything had started. His men learned quickly that certain rules existed in Teresa's presence. No discussion of business. No weapons visible. If you were carrying, you kept your jacket buttoned. No profanity ever under any circumstances. No references to violence or death or the world they all inhabited the other 6 days of the week. These rules weren't written down. Capone never announced them. But they were understood, enforced by his presence and by the atmosphere that descended whenever Teresa entered a room, a seriousness, a straightening of spines, a sudden interest in good behavior that Chicago's most dangerous men had probably not demonstrated since childhood. There was something almost comic about it, though no one would have dared say so. Men who had survived gang wars and federal raids and back alley ambushes, men with blood on their hands and corruption in their histories, would transform in Teresa's presence into something approximating respectability. Hats came off, voices dropped. Sentences lost their profanity. It wasn't fear exactly, it was something older and more fundamental. The body's memory of what it meant to be a child accountable to someone who genuinely knew the difference between right and wrong. Frank Nitti, Capone's enforcer, one of the most feared men in Chicago, was said to have stood in Teresa's kitchen doorway once, hat literally in hand, unable. to remember a single word of English because she had looked at him while asking how his mother was doing, and the question had struck him as so disarmingly sincere that he had simply stood there like a schoolboy. She asked me about my mother, Nidhi apparently told someone afterward, still slightly bewildered, like she actually wanted to know. She did actually want to know, that was the thing about Teresa. The questions she asked were real questions. The interest she showed was real interest. In a world built on performance and pretense, where everyone was always calculating the angle, Teresa Capone simply related to people as people. And that authenticity in the circles her son moved in was so rare as to be almost supernatural. One story, told by multiple sources in various forms, describes a day in the late 1920s when a meeting was happening at a location Teresa decided to visit. Several of Capone's associates were present, serious men, men who had done serious things, men who were not in the habit of softening their language or their demeanor for anyone. Teresa walked in, assessed the room with the comprehensive efficiency of a woman who had raised 9 children, and looked at one of the associates, who had been in the middle of a colorful description of a business rival. The associate stopped speaking mid-sentence. The silence in the room was total. Teresa looked at the associate for one long moment. Then she turned to her son. "Alphonse, you have enough people to talk to. Come eat with your mother." Capone stood up immediately. Without a word of explanation to anyone, without any acknowledgement that he was leaving an important meeting, without any of the elaborate performance of power that normally governed his movements, he simply stood up and followed his mother into the kitchen. The associate later told someone that her look had made him feel like he was 12 years old again and had been caught stealing from the collection plate. "I don't care who you are," he said. "When that woman looks at you, you behave." What Teresa thought about what her son had become is harder to know. She never gave interviews, never spoke publicly. She was in the tradition of Italian immigrant women of her generation, intensely private about family matters. The idea of discussing your children's affairs with strangers would have been incomprehensible to her. But people who were close to the family described a complexity in her relationship with Al's success that defied simple categorization. She hated the violence, had always hated it, from the street fights of his adolescence to the gang wars of his Chicago years. She prayed for him regularly and sincerely, asking God for something she knew was probably impossible, that her son would find a way out of the life he'd chosen and into something that wouldn't destroy him. At the same time, she benefited from his money. Capone moved her into a better apartment, bought her better furniture, ensured she never wanted for anything. He was generous with his family in a way that people who knew only his public face sometimes found surprising, not just with Teresa, but with all his siblings, his aunts and uncles, the extended network of people connected to him by blood. Teresa accepted the money with a certain pragmatism. She needed it, her children needed it, the money existed, and Al had it, and refusing it on moral grounds was a luxury available to people who already had enough. But she never pretended, never told herself the money was clean, or that the life he was living was acceptable, or that her prayers were unnecessary. She carried the truth of what he was alongside the love she had for who he was, and she held both things simultaneously without letting either one cancel the other. This, perhaps, was the source of her authority over him. She was the only person in his life who loved him completely and clearly, without the distortions of fear or self-interest, and who also saw him completely and clearly, without the distortions of adoration. She saw the scar and the silk suit and the violence and the generosity and the hunger and the loneliness and the frightened boy underneath all of it, and she loved him anyway. That kind of love is the most powerful force in the world. It's also, for the person receiving it, the most humbling. You cannot be your constructed self in front of someone who knew you before you constructed it. When they sent Capone to Atlanta in 1932, Teresa came to visit. She was 65 years old and had never been a well woman. Years of hard labor and difficult pregnancy had taken a physical toll that showed in her walk, in the way she held herself. The journey from Brooklyn to Atlanta was not easy for her. She came anyway. The visiting room at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary was not designed for emotion. It was designed for supervision: hard chairs, a table between visitor and prisoner, guards at regular intervals watching every interaction. Not a place where anyone could pretend the situation was other than what it was. When Teresa walked in and saw her son in his prison uniform, she said nothing for a moment, just looked at him with those eyes that had always seen everything. Then she sat down, reached across the table, and took his hands in hers. "Are you eating?" she asked. Not, "How did this happen?" Not, "I told you so." Not, "Do you understand what you've done to this family?" Just, "Are you eating?" Capone, who had faced federal prosecutors and rival gangsters and the full force of the American government without flinching, found that his eyes were wet. "I'm fine, Mama," he said. The same words he'd been saying since he was 16. She didn't believe them now any more than she had then. "You look thin," she said. "The food is not good here. I'll bring you food. Next time I'll bring food." She came back 3 more times during the Atlanta years, each trip harder than the last on a body that was quietly failing her. She brought food, homemade. Wrapped carefully, the smells of Brooklyn carried into the grim interior of a federal prison. And when they transferred him to Alcatraz in 1934, where family visits were restricted and the logistics more difficult, Teresa still came. Twice. The journey was extraordinary for a woman of her age and health, trained from New York to California, then the prison boat across the bay to the Rock. She came because he was her son. It was that simple. It didn't require further explanation. The visit that people who knew the family talked about most happened in 1935. Capone had been at Alcatraz for a year, and the neurosyphilis was beginning to show in subtle ways, small confusions, moments of disorientation, a flatness to his affect that wasn't there before. The disease was still years from its devastating progression, but it had begun. Teresa was 60. Her health had worsened considerably, her heart was unreliable, her joints painful, her energy diminished. The trip to Alcatraz required a journey by train from New York to San Francisco, then the short but cold and disorienting crossing to the island by prison boat. Capone's brothers had tried to discourage her. The doctors had advised against the travel. Her other children had offered to go in her place, to carry messages, to represent the family. Teresa had looked at each of them in turn and asked one question: "Is it my son in there or your son?" She made the journey. They sat in the Alcatraz visiting room, the same hard chairs, the same table, the same guards watching. Teresa looked at her son for a long time after she sat down. The year in Alcatraz had aged him visibly. He was thinner, his face more drawn, and there was something different in his eyes, something that hadn't been there in Atlanta. A distance, a confusion that came and went like clouds crossing a sun. "Tell me the truth," she said finally, in Italian, as always for important things. "Are you all right?" Capone met her eyes, something he still couldn't quite do when she looked at him that particular way, the way that reached past every defense. Then something in him gave way, the way a man exhausted by the effort of maintaining his own legend finally allows himself, in the presence of the one person who knew him before the legend existed, to simply stop. "No," he said quietly, "I'm not all right." Teresa nodded slowly, as if she'd known, as if she'd traveled 3,000 miles to give him permission to say it out loud. "I'm sick," he continued, his voice lower now, almost inaudible beneath the ambient noise of the visiting room. "Something is wrong with me. The doctors here, they say." He stopped, looked at his hands, which had begun to show the faintest tremor on difficult days. "I'm afraid, Mama." Teresa was quiet for a moment. The guards watched. The other visitors at their tables continued their own conversations, and in the space of that quiet, something passed between mother and son that had no words. "I know," she said simply, 2 words. But in them, everything. She knew he was sick. She knew he was afraid. She knew the life he'd chosen had brought him here, to this table, to this disease, to this slow dissolution of the self she had known before anyone else had known him. "Are you afraid to die?" she asked. Capone was quiet for a long time. "I'm afraid to disappear," he said finally. "I'm afraid of losing myself before I die, of being nothing, of not knowing who I am anymore." Teresa reached across the table and took his face in her hands, an extraordinary gesture in that supervised room, and the guards let it pass because some things are larger than regulations, and every person in that room, whatever their history, understood what they were witnessing. She held his face and looked at him directly, her eyes holding his without wavering. "I will know who you are," she said. "As long as I am alive, I will know who you are. You are my son. You are Alphonse. You are not nothing." Capone, public enemy number 1, the man who had made Chicago tremble and federal prosecutors sweat, closed his eyes. And for one moment, in that cold visiting room on an island in San Francisco Bay, he was not a gangster or a criminal or a legend. He was just a son, and she was just his mother, and that was enough. The guards looked away. Teresa Capone outlived her most famous son. Al died in January 1947 at 48, his mind gone and his body giving out at last. Teresa, who had been in declining health for years, lived until November 1952, dying at 85, 5 more years than she perhaps should have had, as if sheer will kept her going past when medicine said she should. Those who knew her in her final years said she kept a photograph of Al on her bedside table. Not the famous photographs, not the newspaper images of the smirking gangster in the expensive suit, the ones that defined him for history. A family photograph from before the fame, from when he was just a son in a Brooklyn kitchen, and she was just a mother watching him eat Sunday dinner, and the future was still entirely unknown. She prayed for him every day after his death, not for his soul in the way of conventional religion. She knew what he had done, and she wasn't naive about what that meant. She prayed for him the way mothers pray for children they could not save, with love that doesn't diminish after death, with grief that lives alongside everything else and never quite resolves, with the quiet persistence of someone who has decided that the relationship does not end simply because one party is no longer present. In the end, what was true about Al Capone and Teresa was simple and simply human. She was the one person who loved him without conditions, and he was the one person before whom he had no conditions to maintain. The empire, the violence, the legend, all of it fell away at her kitchen table, in her visiting room chair, in the Italian phrases she used for things. That mattered too much for English. He was her son, she was his mother, everything else was secondary. Some things are more powerful than empires, some forces are older than fear. And for Al Capone, the most feared man in America, the most powerful force of all was a small Neapolitan woman who had crossed an ocean for a better life and spent the rest of it making sure that her most difficult child knew, without question and without condition, that he was loved. He carried that knowledge through Brooklyn streets and Chicago boardrooms and federal prisons and mental fog. He carried it until he couldn't carry anything anymore. And Teresa carried it after him to her own grave 5 years later. Two people who loved each other beyond reason, beyond circumstances, beyond everything. That, in the end, is the part of Al Capone's story that history forgot to tell.